The scorching August sun hung mercilessly over the Montana territory, as Clara Vaughn stared in horror at the smoke billowing from beneath her cabin door. Her trembling hands fumbled with the latch that refused to budge, the wood already swelling from the heat of the flames that had started in her kitchen. "Please, God, not like this," she whispered, her lungs burning as the smoke thickened around her. It was 1875, and Clara had been living alone for nearly 2 years since her father's passing. At 23, she had managed their small homestead with fierce determination, despite the warnings from townsfolk that a woman couldn't survive alone in the unforgiving wilderness. Now, as flames licked up the cabin walls, panic seized her throat. The door had swollen shut in the heat, trapping her inside her own home. Outside, Zachary Nash spotted the smoke while riding the boundary of his newly acquired ranch. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse toward the rising black cloud. He'd only arrived in the territory 3 months prior, seeking a fresh start after years of drifting through the frontier. At 28, Zach had seen enough death and hardship to last several lifetimes. When he reached the small cabin nestled against the foothills, flames were already consuming the rear portion of the structure. He dismounted in one fluid motion, rushing toward the door where he could hear frantic pounding from within. "Hello, is someone in there?" He shouted, pressing his ear against the hot wood. "Help me," Clara cried out, her voice cracking. "The door's stuck, I can't get out." Zach backed up, assessing the situation. The windows were too small for escape, and the fire was spreading rapidly. Without hesitation, he positioned himself and charged shoulder first into the door. "You're coming out," he shouted as the wood splintered under his weight. His shoulder screamed in pain, but he rammed again, harder. "Stand back." On the third attempt, the door gave way with a crack, sending him stumbling into the smoke-filled cabin. Through watering eyes, he saw a young woman crouched near the doorway, her face smudged with soot, her honey-colored hair falling loose from its pins. "Come on." He grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "We need to go now." Clara stumbled forward, coughing violently as they emerged into the blinding daylight. Zach half carried her away from the burning structure, not stopping until they reached the safety of an old oak tree 50 yards away. As they collapsed onto the grass, the roof of the cabin caved in with a thunderous crash, sending sparks skyward in a terrible, beautiful display. Clara watched in stunned silence as her entire life went up in flames. Everything she owned, her father's belongings, family heirlooms, the quilt her mother had made before passing, all gone in moments. "I'm sorry," Zach said, his voice rough from the smoke. "There's nothing more we can do." She turned to look at her rescuer for the first time. His face was streaked with soot, but she could see kind eyes beneath the grime blue as a mountain lake. His dark hair was disheveled, and a day's worth of stubble lined his strong jaw. He wasn't a stranger exactly. She'd glimpsed him in town once or twice, the newcomer who'd bought the old Hawkins place. "Thank you," she managed, her throat raw. "If you hadn't come along." She couldn't finish the thought. "Zachary Nash," he said, offering a small nod. "I saw the smoke from my property. Are you hurt?" "Clara Vaughn," she replied. "I don't think so, just shocked." As they watched the cabin burn, Clara felt the weight of her situation settling over her. She was alone, with nothing but the clothes on her back and nowhere to go. Her nearest neighbors were miles away, and she had no family left to turn to. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Zach asked, seeming to read her thoughts. Clara shook her head, fighting back tears that suddenly threatened to overwhelm her. "No, everything I had was in there." Zach hesitated only a moment before making a decision. "I have a spare room at my ranch house. It's nothing fancy, but you'd be welcome to it while you figure things out." Under normal circumstances, Clara would have refused. A proper woman didn't stay with a man she barely knew. But these weren't normal circumstances, and the alternative was sleeping under the stars with mountain lions and who knew what else prowling about. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Nash. Just for tonight, if it's not too much trouble." Zach whistled for his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding that trotted over obediently. "Trouble would be leaving you out here with nothing. Can you ride?" Clara nodded. She'd been riding since before she could walk. "Then we'll share shadow here. My place is about 2 miles east." As Zach helped her onto his horse, Clara took one last look at the smoldering remains of her home. 16 years of memories reduced to ash in less than an hour. Somehow, in the midst of her grief, she felt a strange sense of freedom mingled with the loss, as if the fire had burned away more than just timber and belongings. Zachary mounted behind her, reaching around to take the reins. Clara stiffened at the unexpected closeness, the solid warmth of him at her back. It had been a long time since she'd been this near to another person, especially a man. "Hold on," he instructed, urging Shadow into a walk, careful to keep a respectful distance despite their proximity. As they rode away from the ruins, Clara couldn't help wondering if she'd made a mistake trusting this stranger. But something in his steady hands on the reins, and the gentle way he'd asked if she was hurt told her she might have found the one decent man in the territory. What she didn't know then was how completely Zachary Nash would change her life, or that the fire that had nearly claimed her would be the spark that ignited something neither of them had been looking for. The Nash ranch house stood silhouetted against the setting sun when they arrived. It was larger than Clara had expected, a two-story structure built of solid timber with a wide front porch and glass windows that caught the golden light. Outbuildings dotted the property, and a small herd of cattle grazed in a distant pasture. "It's lovely," Clara said, genuinely surprised. Most bachelor ranchers lived in little more than shacks until they found wives to make proper homes. "Can't take credit for it," Zach replied as he dismounted and reached up to help her down. Previous owner built it for his family. Had plans to raise 6 children here, but his wife took ill and passed before they could start their family. He couldn't bear to stay after that. His hands were steady at her waist as she slid from the saddle, and Clara was suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look, her dress singed in places, her hair a tangled mess, her face surely blackened with soot. "I must look a fright," she said, attempting to smooth her skirts. Zach's lips quirked into a half smile. "You look like someone who survived a fire, nothing frightful about that." He led her inside after seeing to his horse. The interior of the house was sparsely furnished but clean and well-maintained. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, with a worn leather armchair and a simple wooden table with 4 chairs making up the rest of the furnishings. Bookshelves lined one wall, surprisingly full for a cowboy, Clara thought. The previous owner left most of his belongings, Zach explained, noticing her gaze on the books. "Couldn't bear to take them, I suppose. Kitchen's through there and the spare room is upstairs, first door on the right. Bathrooms at the end of the hall, there's a pump and water heater, so you can have a hot bath if you'd like." Clara blinked in surprise. "A water heater, out here," Zach smiled properly this time. Hawkins was something of an inventor, rigged up a system that heats water from the kitchen stove. "It's a marvel, really. I haven't had a proper hot bath since." Clara trailed off, thinking of the hours she'd spent hauling and heating water at her cabin, usually settling for quick washes instead of full baths. "Help yourself. I'll find you something clean to wear and start on some supper." "You must be starving." Before she could protest, Zach disappeared up the stairs, returning moments later with a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers. "They'll be too big, but they're clean. We can ride into town tomorrow to get you proper things." Clara accepted the clothes with murmured thanks, uncomfortable with his kindness. She was used to managing on her own, not accepting charity. But right now, she had little choice. The bath was indeed a luxury she hadn't experienced in years. The hot water soothed her smoke-irritated skin and washed away the soot and ash that clung to her. As she scrubbed herself clean, Clara allowed tears to finally fall. She'd lost everything: her father's pocket watch, her mother's Bible, the family photographs that had been her only connection to a past she barely remembered. When she emerged downstairs, dressed in Zach's too large clothing with her damp hair braided over one shoulder, she found him at the stove, stirring something that smelled delicious. "Feel better?" he asked without turning. "Much, thank you." She hesitated in the doorway. "Mr. Nash, I don't know how to repay your kindness." He turned then, a wooden spoon in hand. "No need, anyone would have done the same, but they wouldn't have, and they both knew it." The territory was filled with men who would have taken advantage of a woman in her situation or worse, simply ridden past without stopping to help at all. Still, Clara insisted, I'd like to earn my keep while I'm here. I'm a good cook and I can clean, mend, let's not worry about all that tonight, Zach interrupted gently. You've been through enough today. Sit, eat, tomorrow we'll figure things out. The stew was simple but hearty, with chunks of venison, potatoes, and carrots. Clara hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful hit her tongue. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the events of the day catching up to her with each passing minute. Do you know what caused the fire? Zach finally asked. Clara shook her head. I was cleaning in the bedroom when I smelled smoke. By the time I got to the kitchen, flames were already climbing up the wall behind the stove. I tried to put it out, but it spread so quickly. She shuddered at the memory. Before I knew it, the whole back of the cabin was engulfed and the door had swollen shut from the heat. You're lucky to be alive, Zach said quietly. Thanks to you. Clara met his eyes across the table. Truly, Mr. Nash, I don't know how to thank you. Zach, he corrected. And you'd do the same for anyone else. Later, as Clara lay in the unfamiliar bed in the spare room, she stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. She'd always prided herself on her independence, on not needing anyone since her father died. Now she was dependent on the kindness of a stranger, a handsome stranger, who'd risked his life to save hers. She didn't know then that the fire that had destroyed her home would be the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She didn't know that the man sleeping downstairs would become more important to her than anyone who'd come before. All she knew was that, for the first time in years, she wasn't alone, and despite everything she'd lost, that knowledge brought an unexpected comfort as she finally drifted into sleep. Morning came with the crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee wafting up the stairs. Clara woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly in Zach's borrowed clothes, feeling strange in the masculine attire, but grateful for its warmth and cleanliness. When she descended the stairs, she found Zach already dressed and cooking breakfast, bacon sizzling in a cast iron pan while he cracked eggs into a bowl. Good morning, he said, glancing up with a smile. Sleep well, better than I expected to, Clara admitted. She moved to his side, gently taking the bowl from his hands. Let me help. He relinquished the bowl without argument, stepping aside to tend the bacon while she whisked the eggs. They worked together with surprising ease, moving around each other as if they'd done this dance 100 times before. I thought we might ride into town today, Zach said as they sat down to eat. You'll need clothes and other necessities, and we should let the sheriff know about the fire. Clara nodded, though the thought of facing people filled her with dread. Everyone would know her situation, would be whispering about her staying with Zachary Nash. Small towns thrived on gossip, and a woman alone was always subject to scrutiny. I have some money saved, she said. Not much, but enough for a few things, and perhaps I can find work in town. Zach studied her across the table. What kind of work are you looking for? Anything, really. I can sew, cook, clean. I helped my father with his accounts, so I'm good with numbers. She shrugged. I'm not proud. I'll take whatever's available. Actually, Zach said slowly, I've been thinking about that. I could use help around here. The place is too big for one person, and I've been meaning to hire someone to cook and keep house while I'm working the ranch. If you're interested, the job is yours with room and board included, of course. Clara stared at him, suspicion warring with gratitude. Are you offering out of pity, Mr. Nash? Zach, he corrected again. And no, not pity, practicality. You need work, I need help. Seems like a simple solution to both our problems. People will talk, Clara warned. A single woman living in a single man's house, even as an employee. People always talk, Zach replied with a dismissive wave of his hand. I've never much cared what others think. But if it bothers you, we can find another arrangement. Clara considered the offer. It was true that she needed work, and staying here would give her time to save money and decide what to do next. And despite having just met him, she felt strangely comfortable with Zachary Nash. There was something solid and trustworthy about him, a rarity in these parts. All right, she decided. I accept your offer, temporarily at least, until I can get back on my feet. Zach nodded, seemingly pleased. Good. We'll draw up terms when we return from town so everything's proper and businesslike. The ride to town took nearly an hour, with Clara once again sharing Zach's horse. He'd offered to hitch up the wagon, but she declined, preferring the quicker journey on horseback despite the impropriety of riding with him. After all, her reputation was likely already compromised by staying the night at his ranch. Timber Creek was a small but growing settlement, with a main street boasting a general store, saloon, small hotel, sheriff's office, and a handful of other establishments. As they rode in, Clara was painfully aware of the curious glances cast their way her in men's clothing, riding double with the newcomer rancher. Their first stop was the sheriff's office, where Clara recounted the events of the fire. Sheriff Miller, a grizzled veteran of the frontier with kind eyes that had seen too much, took notes and promised to ride out to investigate the site. Might have been a faulty stove, he suggested. Seen it happen before. Lucky Nash here spotted the smoke when he did. Yes, Clara agreed softly. Very lucky. Their next stop was the general store, where Mrs. Patterson, the owner's wife, helped Clara select several ready-made dresses, undergarments, and other necessities. Zach excused himself during this portion of the shopping, saying he had business at the feed store. Quite the gentleman, that Mr. Nash, Mrs. Patterson commented as she measured Clara for a dress that would need alteration. Not like some of the rough types we get through here. He's been very kind, Clara replied carefully. Heard about your cabin, the older woman said, her face softening with sympathy. Such a terrible thing. Will you be staying in town now? Clara hesitated, knowing her answer would travel through Timber Creek faster than a telegram. Actually, Mr. Nash has offered me employment as his housekeeper, just temporarily until I can make other arrangements. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly, but to her credit, she didn't comment directly. Well, it's good of him to help. That ranch house is far too big for a bachelor. Could use a woman's touch. By the time Zach returned, Clara had selected everything she needed, including a few practical items for housekeeping duties. She insisted on paying from her meager savings, though Zach argued that it should be considered an advance on her wages. You haven't even worked a day yet, he pointed out. Let me cover this. No, Clara said firmly. I need to start as I mean to go on, Mr. Nash. I won't be indebted to you more than I already am. He seemed about to argue further but then nodded, respecting her decision. As you wish. But it's still Zach, not Mr. Nash. If we're to live under the same roof, we might as well use our given names. Clara felt her cheeks warm at his words and the interested look Mrs. Patterson was trying to hide behind the counter. Very well, Zach. Their final stop in town was the bank, where Clara needed to access her small savings account. As they approached the building, a group of men emerged from the saloon across the street. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stopped abruptly when he spotted Zach. Well, look who it is, he called, his voice carrying across the street. Zachary Nash playing hero to another damsel. Clara felt Zach stiffen beside her. Ignore him, he muttered. The man crossed the street, his companions following. Up close, Clara could see that the scar on his face was relatively fresh, the tissue still pink and angry. Heard you took in Miss Vaughn after her unfortunate accident, the man said, his tone making the word accident sound sinister. Always ready to rescue a pretty lady, aren't you, Nash? Move along, Harker, Zach replied, his voice cold. Miss Vaughn doesn't need to hear your nonsense. The man Harker smirked, his gaze sliding to Clara with an assessment that made her skin crawl. Miss Vaughn might want to know who she's shacking up with. Your new friend has a way of leaving destruction in his wake, darling. Before Zach could respond, Sheriff Miller appeared behind them. Problem here, gentlemen. Harker's smile didn't reach his eyes. No problem at all, Sheriff, just welcoming Miss Vaughn to town. He tipped his hat mockingly. Good day to you both. As Harker and his men sauntered away, Clara glanced at Zach. His face had gone hard, jaw clenched tight with barely controlled anger. Who was that? She asked quietly as they continued toward the bank. Victor Harker, Zach answered tersely. Local troublemaker. Owns the saloon and thinks it makes him important. He seems to have a personal issue with you, Zach sighed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. We had a disagreement shortly after I arrived. He tried to swindle a young widow out of her property. I stepped in. Is that how he got that scar? A ghost of a smile touched Zach's lips. He claims I'm responsible. I couldn't possibly comment. Clara found herself smiling back despite the unsettling encounter. There was clearly more to Zachary Nash than met the eye and more to his history with Victor Harker than he was sharing. They completed their business at the bank without further incident, though Clara was aware of curious glances throughout their time in town. By the time they headed back to the ranch, the sun was high in the sky, and Clara was exhausted from the emotional strain of facing the town after her loss. You handled yourself well today, Zach commented as they rode home, Clara once again seated in front of him on Shadow. Not everyone would be so composed after losing everything. Not everything, Clara corrected quietly. I still have my life thanks to you, she felt rather than saw his shrug. You'd have found a way out. No, she said, turning slightly to look at him. I wouldn't have. The door was completely jammed and the windows were too small, if you hadn't come along when you did. She shuddered at the thought. Zach was quiet for a moment. Then I'm glad I was there. The simple sincerity in his voice touched something in Clara. Here was a man who had saved her life, offered her a home and employment, and asked for nothing in return. In a territory where most men saw women as either potential wives or objects to be used, Zachary Nash's respectful treatment was as refreshing as it was unexpected. What she didn't yet understand was why Victor Harker's words had affected him so strongly, or what past events had brought Zach to this remote corner of the Montana territory. But as they rode together through the golden afternoon light, those questions seemed less important than the strange sense of rightness she felt in his company. Over the next few weeks, Clara and Zach settled into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. True to his word, he had drawn up a formal employment agreement, complete with wages and clear expectations of her duties. She was to cook, clean, and manage the household, with Sundays off and the freedom to use her spare time as she wished. The work was straightforward enough. The ranch house, though large, was easy to maintain with just the two of them living there. Zach was naturally tidy, and he took his meals at regular hours, making her job simpler than she'd anticipated. He spent most daylight hours working the ranch with his two hired hands, Tom and Ellie, giving Clara plenty of space to herself. September brought cooler temperatures and spectacular sunsets that painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Clara often found herself pausing in her work to watch the changing light, a sense of peace settling over her that she hadn't expected to find so soon after losing her home. One evening, as she was preparing supper, Zach came in earlier than usual. He looked tired but satisfied the way he always did after a productive day. Something smells wonderful, he said, washing his hands at the kitchen pump. Beef stew, Clara replied, stirring the pot, and I baked bread this morning. You're spoiling me, Zach said with a smile. I lived on beans and hardtack before you came along, Clara laughed. I find that hard to believe. You're too good a cook yourself. Good enough to survive, not to enjoy. He dried his hands on a towel. Need any help? You could set the table if you don't mind. They moved around each other with the ease of people who had known each other for years, rather than weeks. As they sat down to eat, Clara found herself studying Zach's face in the lamplight. There was something different about him tonight, a thoughtfulness in his expression that hadn't been there before. Sheriff Miller rode out today, he said after a few minutes of comfortable silence. Clara looked up from her stew. Oh, did he find something at the cabin site? Zach hesitated. He thinks the fire might not have been an accident. The spoon stopped halfway to Clara's mouth. What do you mean? There were signs that the fire started in more than one place, and he found evidence that someone had been watching the cabin boot prints behind that stand of trees to the west. A chill ran through Clara. But who would want to burn down my home? I haven't any enemies. I don't know, Zach admitted, but Miller thinks it might be connected to other incidents in the area. There have been several suspicious fires over the past year, mostly abandoned structures, but this is the first one where someone was inside. Clara set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly gone. You think someone deliberately tried to kill me? No, I don't, Zach said quickly. More likely they didn't know you were home. Your horse wasn't in the corral, was it? No, I'd let him out to graze in the meadow, Clara frowned, thinking. But still, why target my cabin? I have nothing of value. Your land might be valuable to someone, Zach suggested. It's good grazing land with a year-round creek. Plenty of men would do worse than arson to acquire property like that. Clara shook her head in disbelief. It's just a small homestead, barely 40 acres. Strategic 40 acres, though. It connects to the public grazing land to the north and has water rights that would be valuable to any rancher expanding their herd. Zach's expression darkened. Someone might have thought running you off would be easier than making a fair offer. A thought struck Clara. Victor Harker. The way he spoke about my unfortunate accident, he knew about the fire before most people in town did. Zach nodded slowly. I had the same thought. Harker's been buying up small properties all over the territory. Some people say he's planning to control all the water rights and charge ranchers for access. But that's criminal. Only if you can prove it, Zach said grimly. And Harker's careful. Sheriff Miller suspects him of being behind several schemes, but he's never been able to prove anything. Clara pushed her plate away, her mind racing. What am I supposed to do now if Harker burned my cabin to get my land? Your land is still yours, Zach assured her. The deed is safe at the bank, isn't it? Clara nodded. Yes, but I can't exactly live on it now. And I certainly can't afford to rebuild. You have time to decide what to do, Zach said gently. Your position here is secure for as long as you want it. No one can force you to sell your land. Clara looked at him gratefully. Thank you again. It seems I'm always thanking you for something. Zach's smile returned, warming his blue eyes. No thanks needed. I've benefited as much as you have. The house hasn't been this clean or the food this good since, well, ever. Later that night, as Clara prepared for bed, she found herself drawn to the window that faced east toward where her cabin had stood. The moon illuminated the landscape, casting long shadows across the ranch yard and the distant mountains. Somewhere out there, someone had deliberately destroyed her home, possibly intending to harm her in the process. The thought should have terrified her, but strangely, she felt more angry than afraid. She'd built a life for herself after her father died, had proven to everyone including herself that she could survive on her own. Now someone had taken that from her, and not by fair means. A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Clara, Zach's voice was low. Are you still awake? She quickly pulled a shawl around her shoulders over her nightdress. Yes, come in. The door opened, and Zach stood there, still fully dressed. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I wanted to let you know I'll be riding out early tomorrow with the sheriff. We're going to look more closely at the cabin site, see if we can find anything Miller might have missed. I'd like to come with you, Clara said immediately. Zach looked surprised. Are you sure? It won't be easy to see. It's my home, she said simply. I need to see it in daylight to say goodbye properly, and if there are clues about who did this, I want to help find them. After a moment, Zach nodded. All right, we'll leave at first light. He hesitated in the doorway. Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow will be difficult enough without exhaustion added to it. I will. Good night, Zach. Good night, Clara. After he closed the door, Clara returned to the window. The peaceful scene outside contrasted sharply with the turmoil of her thoughts. In just a few short weeks, her life had been completely upended, her home destroyed, her independence compromised. Yet somehow, in the midst of that chaos, she'd found an unexpected ally in Zachary Nash, more than an ally, she admitted to herself. In the quiet moments between tasks, in the easy conversations over meals, in the way he looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice something was growing between them. Something that both frightened and exhilarated her. Tomorrow they would return to the ashes of her old life. But tonight, as Clara finally crawled into bed, she found herself wondering if perhaps the fire that had nearly killed her had also, strangely, set her free. The ride to Clara's former homestead was silent, the early morning mist hanging low over the landscape as they followed Sheriff Miller through the forest trails. Zach had insisted Clara ride her own horse this time, a gentle mare named Daisy that he kept for occasional visitors. The familiar rhythm of riding helped calm Clara's nerves as they approached the blackened remains of her cabin. In the clear light of morning, the destruction was even more complete than she had imagined. Only the stone chimney remained standing, a lone sentinel over a charred rectangle of debris. The surrounding trees showed scorch marks, though thankfully the fire hadn't spread to the forest. Clara dismounted slowly, handing her reins to Zach before approaching the ruins. Each step felt heavier than the last as she surveyed what remained of 16 years of her life. The iron cookstove lay twisted among the ashes. A few metal implements, the head of her father's axe, the frame of her mother's hand mirror poked through the debris like strange artifacts from a forgotten time. "I'm sorry, Miss Vaughn," Sheriff Miller said, removing his hat respectfully. "It's a terrible thing," Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She moved carefully around the perimeter, remembering where each room had been, what treasures each had contained. Here was where her father's desk had stood, there her mother's rocking chair. All gone now, reduced to ash and memory. As she circled to what had been the back of the cabin, something caught her eye, a glint of metal half buried in the dirt near where the kitchen door had been. Kneeling, Clara brushed away ash and soil to reveal a tarnished silver locket, her mother's, which she'd kept in a small box on the mantel. "Look," she called, holding up her find. It survived. Zach and the sheriff came to her side as she carefully opened the locket. Inside were two tiny portraits, her mother and father on their wedding day, their young faces smiling out from the past. "It must have been thrown clear when the roof collapsed," Zach said softly. Clara clutched the locket tightly. "It's all I have left of them now." Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. "Miss Vaughn, if you don't mind, I'd like to show you what makes me suspicious about this fire." He led them to several spots around the cabin, pointing out areas where the burning pattern seemed unnatural. "See here and here, separate points of origin. And this," he kicked at something in the dirt, "is what remains of a kerosene can. It wasn't from your cabin, was it?" Clara shook her head. "I used lamp oil, not kerosene." "Exactly what I thought." Miller's weathered face was grim. "Whoever did this came prepared." "They soaked several areas with kerosene before lighting it up." "But why?" Clara asked, the reality of someone deliberately destroying her home still difficult to comprehend. "That's what we need to figure out." The sheriff turned to Zach. "Nash, show her what you found yesterday." Zach led Clara to a spot about 30 yards from the cabin where a stand of pines provided good cover with a clear view of the homestead. "See these?" He pointed to impressions in the soft earth. "Boot prints. Someone stood here watching, probably making sure the fire took hold." Clara knelt to examine the prints. They were large, a man's boots with a distinctive pattern on the sole. "Can you tell who made these?" "Not specifically," Miller answered. "But they're from expensive boots, not the kind most ranchers or farmers around here would wear." Clara thought immediately of Victor Harker, with his fine clothes and air of prosperity that set him apart from most Timber Creek residents. "Could it be Harker?" The sheriff exchanged a look with Zach. "It's possible. He's been trying to buy up water rights all over the county. But without evidence linking him directly to this, there's not much I can do." "What about my land?" Clara asked. "Is it safe?" "As long as you hold the deed, yes," Miller assured her. "But I'd keep that document close if I were you, and be careful. Whoever did this might not be happy you survived." The warning sent a chill through Clara. "You think they might try again?" "I think you're safer at Nash's place than you would be alone," the sheriff said diplomatically. "Harker, if it was him, isn't likely to try anything there. Too many witnesses with Nash's ranch hands around." They spent another hour searching the site, but found nothing else of significance. As they prepared to leave, Clara stood before the chimney one last time, the silver locket hanging around her neck where it belonged. "Goodbye," she whispered, to the ruins, to the memories, to the life she'd known. Then, with a straightening of her shoulders, she turned to where Zach waited with her horse. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded, allowing him to help her mount. "Yes, there's nothing more for me here." As they rode away, she didn't look back. Whatever the future held, whether she eventually rebuilt or sold the land, she knew the cabin that had been her childhood home was gone forever. The only way now was forward. Back at the ranch, Clara threw herself into her duties with renewed vigor, as if keeping busy could somehow hold at bay the darker thoughts that threatened when she was idle. She scrubbed floors that were already clean, reorganized the pantry, and began a thorough inventory of the household linens. Zach watched her with concern but said nothing. giving her the space she seemed to need. On the third evening after their visit to the cabin site, however, he intercepted her as she was about to embark on an unnecessary polishing of the already gleaming banisters. "Clara," he said gently, taking the polishing cloth from her hands, "you need to rest." "I'm fine," she insisted, though the dark circles under her eyes told a different story. "You're exhausted. You've barely slept since we visited your homestead." Clara sighed, the fight suddenly going out of her. "How do you know that?" "Because I hear you pacing at night," Zach admitted. "My room is below yours, remember?" She closed her eyes briefly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't." He guided her to a chair by the fire. "Sit." "Please." Clara sank into the chair, suddenly aware of how tired she truly was. Zach disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with 2 mugs of steaming liquid. "It's not whiskey, though you might prefer that," he said with a small smile, handing her one of the mugs. "Just hot cider with cinnamon." The warm, spiced drink was comforting, and Clara found herself relaxing as she sipped it. Zach took the chair opposite her, the firelight playing across his features as he studied her. "Want to talk about what's keeping you awake?" he asked after a comfortable silence. Clara stared into the flames. "I keep thinking about who might have set the fire, if it was Harker. What kind of man burns down a woman's home to acquire land? What kind of monster does that knowing someone might be inside?" "The kind who values profit over people," Zach said, his voice hardening. "Harker wouldn't be the first man to decide human life is worth less than material gain. You seem to know him well." Zach took a long drink from his mug before answering. "Not well, but I know his type. I've encountered men like him before." There was something in his tone, a personal note that suggested more than general observation. Clara looked at him closely. "Is that why you came to Timber Creek? Because of men like Harker?" The question seemed to surprise him. He set down his mug, his expression becoming guarded. "What makes you ask that?" "Something Harker said in town, about you leaving destruction in your wake and the way you reacted." Clara leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to tell me, Zach. But if there's something I should know about you, about why someone might want to hurt you or those associated with you, I think I have a right to that information now." Zach was silent for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "I was a lawman before I came here, a U.S. Marshal in Wyoming Territory. My last assignment was tracking down a gang that had been terrorizing small towns: robbery, extortion, arson. Their leader was a man named James Blackwell." Clara listened intently, sensing this was a story Zach rarely shared. "We cornered them in a small settlement called Pine Ridge. There was a gunfight. It was bad. Blackwell and most of his men were killed, but not before they took out 3 of my deputies." Zach's gaze was fixed on the fire, seeing something beyond the flames. "There was a family living next to where we had Blackwell pinned down, a young couple with 2 little girls. Blackwell set their house on fire as a distraction. I got them out, but..." He paused, swallowing hard. "The youngest girl was badly burned. She survived, but she'll carry those scars forever. And the townsfolk, they blamed me, said I should have known what Blackwell would do, should have evacuated the area before confronting him." "That's not fair," Clara protested. "You couldn't have known." "Maybe I should have," Zach replied, his voice rough with old guilt. "Blackwell had used fire before. It was his signature. And one of the men who escaped during the chaos was Victor Harker." Clara's eyes widened. "Harker was part of Blackwell's gang," Zach nodded grimly. "Blackwell's right-hand man. He vanished after Pine Ridge. I tracked him for months, but the trail went cold. Then, 3 months ago, I walked into the saloon here in Timber Creek and found myself face to face with him." "He recognized you," Clara guessed, immediately. "And I him, despite the new scar." A ghost of a smile touched Zach's lips. "That was courtesy of the girl's father before Harker escaped. He slashed him with a broken bottle. Does Sheriff Miller know who Harker really is?" "Yes, but proving his connection to Blackwell's gang is nearly impossible now. All the witnesses are dead or scattered to the winds, and Harker has been careful to establish himself as a legitimate businessman here." Clara absorbed this information, pieces falling into place. "So when you interfered with his attempt to swindle the widow, he saw it as a continuation of our old feud, yes, and he's right, in a way. I resigned my marshal's badge after Pine Ridge, but I haven't stopped trying to bring Harker to justice. Is that why you bought the ranch? To keep an eye on him, Zach nodded. Partly, I also genuinely wanted a fresh start, but when I discovered Harker was here, operating the same schemes he ran with Blackwell. You couldn't walk away, Clara finished for him. No, not again. Zach met her eyes directly. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't want to frighten you, and honestly, I've grown accustomed to keeping my past to myself. Clara considered his story, understanding now why he'd been so quick to suspect Harker of setting the fire. If Harker burned my cabin, it might not have been just about my land. It could have been a message to you. Zach's expression darkened. The thought has occurred to me. Harker knows I've been watching him, using fire that's deliberately invoking what happened at Pine Ridge. And if he knew we'd met. But we hadn't met before the fire, Clara pointed out. Unless he was already watching both of us, Zach concluded, which means he may have been planning something long before your cabin burned. The implications of this were chilling. If Harker had targeted her not just for her land, but as a way to get at Zach, she was caught in a dangerous game she hadn't known existed. What do we do now? She asked quietly. We're careful, Zach replied. We watch, we wait, and we gather evidence. Miller is on our side, but he needs proof to move against Harker. Clara nodded, though the prospect of waiting for Harker to make another move was deeply unsettling. Thank you for telling me the truth. It can't have been easy to share that. You deserved to know, Zach said simply. Then, with a lighter tone, and now that you do, perhaps you'll be able to sleep instead of reorganizing my kitchen for the third time this week. Clara laughed despite herself. You noticed that. I notice everything about you, Clara, Zach said softly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Their eyes met across the space between them, and something shifted in the air in acknowledgement of what had been growing between them these past weeks. Clara felt her heart quicken, aware suddenly of how alone they were in the warm, firelit room, of how his gaze lingered on her face. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Zach cleared his throat and stood, breaking the spell. It's getting late, he said. We should both get some rest. Clara rose as well, oddly disappointed yet relieved at the same time. Whatever was developing between them was complicated enough without adding Harker's threats to the mix. Good night, Zach, she said, moving toward the stairs, and thank you for the cider. And the truth. Good night, Clara, he replied, his voice warm with something more than friendship, but carefully restrained. Sleep well. That night, for the first time since the fire, Clara slept deeply and dreamlessly, the silver locket clutched in her hand like a talisman against the darkness. October arrived with its brilliant foliage and crisp mornings. The routine of ranch life continued, with Clara managing the household while Zach and his men prepared for the coming winter. There had been no further incidents since the fire, but Clara remained vigilant, especially when she rode into town for supplies. She had seen Victor Harker only once during these excursions. He had watched her from the saloon's porch as she loaded purchases into the wagon, his gaze calculating. Clara had met his stare directly, refusing to show fear, and after a moment, he had tipped his hat in mock salute before disappearing inside. The encounter had left her shaken but determined. If Harker thought he could intimidate her, he was sorely mistaken. Clara Vaughn had survived losing both parents, managed a homestead alone for 2 years, and escaped a burning building. She wouldn't be cowed by a man like Harker, no matter how dangerous. On a particularly fine autumn day, Zach suggested they ride out to check the western boundary of his property. The aspens are at their peak, he said, and I could use your opinion on something. Curious, Clara agreed. They packed a simple lunch and set out mid-morning, riding side by side through meadows where the grass had turned golden in the autumn sun. The aspens were indeed spectacular, their leaves shimmering like coins of pure gold against the deep green of the pines. It's beautiful, Clara said as they reached a ridge overlooking a small valley. I've always loved this time of year, even better than spring. Zach asked, dismounting and helping her down from her horse. Spring is all promise, Clara replied, taking in the panorama before them. Autumn is fulfillment. There's something more honest about it. Zach smiled at her assessment. I never thought of it that way, but you're right. He spread a blanket on a patch of grass, and they sat to enjoy their lunch of bread, cheese, and apples. The conversation flowed easily between them, as it always did now. Over the past weeks, they had shared stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their disappointments. Clara had told him about losing her mother to influenza when she was 12, and her father's struggle to raise her alone. Zach had spoken of his own parents, his father a blacksmith, his mother a schoolteacher, and his decision to become a lawman after his father was killed by bandits. As they finished eating, Zach grew quiet, seemingly lost in thought. "You said you wanted my opinion on something," Clara prompted gently. "Yes." He gestured toward the valley below them. "That land there, it's for sale. The owner's moving east to be with his daughter. It's good land with a stream running through it and enough flat ground for building." Clara studied the property. "It's lovely. Are you thinking of buying it?" "I am," Zach confirmed. "But not for myself. I thought perhaps you might be interested." Clara turned to him in surprise. "Me? Your homestead land is valuable, but it's also isolated and has difficult memories now," Zach explained. "This property is closer to town and to my ranch. If you sold your land and used the money to buy here, you could build a new home, a fresh start." Clara was momentarily speechless. The suggestion was unexpectedly thoughtful, a solution to problems she'd been turning over in her mind for weeks. "That's very kind of you to think of," she finally said. "But I'm not sure I can afford new construction, even if I sold my land." "Actually," Zach said, looking slightly embarrassed, "there's already a small cabin on the property, nothing fancy but solid. The previous owner used it as a hunting lodge. It would need some work, but it's livable." Clara's mind raced with possibilities. A new home, close enough to town for safety but with enough land for privacy. She could keep her position at Zach's ranch while establishing her own place again, regaining the independence she valued so highly. "Would you like to see it?" Zach asked. "The cabin, I mean. It's just over that rise." "Yes," Clara decided. "I'd like that very much." They packed up their lunch things and rode down into the valley, following a deer trail through a stand of pines until they emerged in a small clearing. The cabin sat nestled against the hillside, its logs weathered to a soft silver gray. It was indeed small, just one room with a stone chimney, but Clara could immediately see its potential. Zach produced a key. "Old man Jenkins gave me this when I expressed interest, said I could look around anytime." The interior was dusty but sound. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and windows on 3 sides let in ample light. There was a small iron stove in one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed frame against the far wall. "It needs a woman's touch," Zach said, watching Clara as she explored the space. "But the roof is good and the foundation's solid." Clara ran her hand along the mantelpiece, already envisioning how she might arrange her few possessions, what curtains would suit the windows, where she might plant a garden come spring. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Absolutely perfect." The joy in her voice brought a smile to Zach's face. "You could make it your own, and it's close enough that—" He trailed off, suddenly hesitant. "Close enough that what?" "That we could still see each other," he finished. "Even after you no longer need employment at the ranch." Clara turned to face him, suddenly aware of how small the cabin was, how close they were standing. "Is that what you want, to still see me?" Zach took a step toward her, his blue eyes intent on her face. "Clara, surely you know by now that the sound of approaching horses interrupted whatever he had been about to say. They both froze, listening as multiple riders approached the cabin. "Were you expecting someone?" Clara whispered. Zach shook his head, moving swiftly to the window. "No." "And that sounds like at least 3 horses." He drew his revolver, motioning for Clara to stay back from the windows. "Could be nothing," he murmured. Jenkins might have mentioned to others that the property was for sale, but his tense posture told Clara he didn't believe that. She moved to another window, peering cautiously through the dusty glass. What she saw made her blood run cold. Victor Harker was dismounting from his horse, flanked by 2 rough-looking men she didn't recognize. All 3 were armed, and none looked like prospective property buyers. "It's Harker," she whispered urgently. "And 2 others." Zach's expression hardened. "They must have followed us from the ranch. I was careless." Clara's mind raced. The cabin had only one door and the windows were too small for escape. They were effectively trapped. "Well, well, what have we here?" Harker's voice called from outside. "Nash and Miss Vaughn out for a romantic picnic. How sweet." "What do you want, Harker?" Zach called back, his voice steady despite the danger. "Just a friendly conversation," Harker replied. "Why don't you come on out and we'll talk like civilized folks?" "I don't consider burning down a woman's home very civilized," Zach countered. "Is that what you want to discuss?" There was a pause, then a chuckle that raised the hairs on Clara's arms. "Clever as always, Nash." "Yes, let's talk about fires. You seem to have a knack for them, or at least for being nearby when they start." Clara glanced at Zach, saw the muscle ticking in his jaw. Harker was deliberately provoking him, bringing up Pine Ridge. "What do we do?" she whispered. "They've got us outnumbered." "We talk," Zach replied grimly. "For now, I won't let him hurt you, Clara." "I'm more worried about him hurting you," she admitted. The look of surprise that crossed Zach's face might have been comical under different circumstances. "Getting impatient out here, Nash," Harker called. "Maybe Miss Vaughn would like to join us instead." "Stay here," Zach instructed, moving toward the door. "If anything happens, there's a trapdoor under the rug, a root cellar. Hide there." Before Clara could protest, Zach had opened the door and stepped outside, keeping his body between the opening and Clara. She moved to the window, heart pounding as she watched the confrontation unfold. "Here I am, Harker," Zach said, his gun still drawn but pointed at the ground. "What's this really about?" Harker stood about 10 yards from the cabin, his men flanking him with rifles at the ready. His scarred face twisted in a smirk. "You know exactly what it's about. You've been interfering with my business since the day you arrived, just like you did in Pine Ridge." "Your business in Pine Ridge was robbery and murder," Zach replied evenly. "Not much different from what you're doing here, just a fancier suit and better manners." Harker's smirk faltered. "I've established myself in this community. People respect me." "They fear you," Zach corrected. "And that only works until someone stands up to you. Like Miss Vaughn here, who refused to be intimidated even after you burned her home to the ground." "You can't prove I had anything to do with that unfortunate accident," Harker said, though his eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. "Can't I?" Zach took a step forward. "We found the kerosene can, Harker, and boot prints that match those fancy boots you're so proud of. Sheriff Miller is building a case as we speak." For the first time, Harker looked unsettled. "Miller's got nothing. He has enough to start asking questions. And once people start talking." Zach let the implication hang in the air. "You're not as clever as you think, Victor. You never were. That's why Blackwell always kept you on a short leash." The mention of Blackwell's name had an immediate effect. Harker's face flushed with anger, his hand dropping to his gun. "Blackwell was a fool," he spat. "He should have killed you when he had the chance." "But he didn't," Zach replied calmly. "And now here we are again, only this time you don't have Blackwell to hide behind." Clara watched the exchange with growing fear. Zach was deliberately antagonizing Harker, drawing his attention away from her and the cabin. But it was a dangerous game. Harker was clearly unstable, his composure cracking with each mention of his past. "I should have made sure you were in that cabin when it burned," Harker snarled, looking past Zach to where Clara stood in the window. "An oversight I intend to correct. Everything happened at once then." Harker drew his gun, Zach lunged forward, and Clara gasped as the sound of a gunshot split the air. One of Harker's men crumpled to the ground, and Clara whirled to see Sheriff Miller at the other window, rifle in hand. "Drop your weapons." Miller shouted as 2 deputies emerged from the trees behind him. "It's over, Harker." Harker hesitated only a moment before firing wildly in Zach's direction. Zach dove to the side, returning fire as he rolled. The second of Harker's men threw down his rifle, hands raised in surrender, but Harker himself turned and ran for his horse. He never made it. Sheriff Miller's second shot caught him in the leg, and he went down hard, cursing viciously as he clutched his bleeding thigh. Clara burst from the cabin, running to where Zach was picking himself up from the ground. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, hands frantically checking for injuries. "I'm fine," Zach assured her, catching her hands in his. "Just some bruises from the fall." "I was so afraid," Clara admitted, the adrenaline of the moment making her voice shake. When he fired at you, I thought, "I'm tougher than I look," Zach said with a smile that didn't quite hide the relief in his eyes. Then, turning to Miller, who was approaching with his deputies, "Your timing couldn't have been better, Sheriff. Been tracking Harker and his boys since they left town," Miller explained. "When they started following you two, I figured they were up to no good." He glanced at the man he'd shot, who was being tended by one of the deputies. "He'll live. Unlike Harker, I'm not aiming to kill." Harker himself had been subdued, his hands cuffed behind his back as a deputy bandaged his leg. His face was a mask of hatred as he glared at Zach and Clara. "This isn't over, Nash," he spat. "Not by a long shot." "Actually, it is," Sheriff Miller countered, producing a folded paper from his coat. "Got a telegram this morning from the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne. They're mighty interested in talking to you about your association with James Blackwell. Seems Nash here kept better records than you gave him credit for." The color drained from Harker's face. "You can't prove anything. It's his word against mine." "And the word of 3 witnesses who recently came forward," Miller added. "Amazing how people find their courage when they hear a man might finally face justice." As the deputies led Harker and his surviving accomplice away, Clara felt a weight lifting that she hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. The man who had destroyed her home, who had nearly killed her, would finally face consequences for his actions. What happens now? She asked, turning to Zach and Sheriff Miller. "Harker will stand trial," Miller replied. "First for the arson here, then likely for his crimes in Wyoming territory. Either way, he won't be troubling Timber Creek again." "And his property?" Zach asked. "The land he acquired through intimidation." "Courts will sort that out," Miller said. "Could take time, but I reckon most of it will go back to the rightful owners or their families." As Sheriff Miller prepared to leave, he paused beside Clara. "Miss Vaughn, once Harker's convicted of burning your cabin, you'll be entitled to compensation. Won't bring back what you lost, but it might help you start over." Clara looked at the small cabin behind them, then at Zach beside her. "I think I've already found a way to do that, Sheriff, but thank you." After Miller had gone, Clara and Zach stood in the clearing, the autumn sunlight filtering through the golden aspen leaves. The danger had passed, but Clara's heart was still racing, not from fear now, but from the realization of how close she had come to losing Zach before she'd even properly found him. "You were going to say something," she said quietly. "Before Harker arrived, what was it?" Zach looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes serious. Then he reached out, gently tucking a strand of honey-colored hair behind her ear. "I was going to say that I've fallen in love with you, Clara Vaughn," he said simply. "That watching you rebuild your life after losing everything has been the most incredible thing I've ever witnessed. That your strength and kindness and determination make me want to be a better man." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Zach, I know it's sudden," he continued. "And I know you value your independence. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, but I wanted you to know in case Harker had succeeded," Clara finished softly. Zach nodded, his expression vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "Life's too short for regrets." "I've had enough of those." Clara stepped closer, her heart full of certainty despite the chaos of the day. "Ask me," she whispered. "What? Ask me for what you want, Zachary Nash, what you're afraid to ask for." Understanding dawned in his eyes. Slowly, reverently, he took her hands in his. "Clara Vaughn, I love you. I want to build a life with you, whether it's in this cabin or my ranch house or somewhere else entirely. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night. I want to be your partner in everything, while still honoring your independence because it's one of the many things I love about you." Tears filled Clara's eyes as she squeezed his hands. "Yes," she said simply. "To all of it, yes." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, then deeper as months of growing feelings finally found expression. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling, their foreheads pressed together. "I love you too," Clara whispered. "I think I have almost from the moment you broke down my cabin door." Zach laughed, the sound joyous in the quiet clearing. "Not the most conventional way to meet the woman of your dreams." "Nothing about us has been conventional," Clara pointed out. "Why start now?" As they rode back to the ranch that evening, plans already forming for their future, Clara found herself thinking of the fire that had nearly claimed her life. It had taken everything she owned, had left her homeless and vulnerable. But in its destruction, it had also cleared the way for something new to grow, something stronger and more beautiful than she could have imagined. The cabin door that wouldn't open had seemed like the end. Instead, it had been just the beginning. Spring came to the Montana Territory in a riot of wildflowers and new beginnings. The small cabin in the valley had been transformed over the winter months, its interior lovingly restored, its surroundings planted with the beginnings of a garden. A fence now enclosed a tidy yard, and a small stable housed 2 horses. On this particular morning, Clara stood on the porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands as she watched the sun rise over the mountains. She wore a simple blue dress, her honey-colored hair loose around her shoulders in the way her husband preferred it. The sound of footsteps behind her brought a smile to her face even before strong arms encircled her waist and warm lips pressed against her neck. "Good morning, Mrs. Nash," Zach murmured against her skin. "You're up early." Clara leaned back against his chest, savoring his warmth. "The baby was restless. I didn't want to wake you." His hand moved to rest protectively over the gentle swell of her stomach. "How is our little firefighter this morning?" The nickname made Clara laugh, as it always did. They had been married for 5 months, having wed in a simple ceremony in Timber Creek just before Christmas. The baby, their first child, was due in late summer, almost exactly a year after the fire that had brought them together. "Active," she replied, covering his hand with hers. "Just like his father, or her mother," Zach countered, turning Clara in his arms to face him. His blue eyes were soft with love as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture that had become familiar and cherished. "Have I told you today how beautiful you are?" "Not yet," Clara teased. "But the day is young." His kiss was gentle, still reverent after all these months. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers in the way that had become habitual between them. "I have news from Sheriff Miller." Clara straightened, suddenly alert. "About Harker," Zach nodded. "The federal court in Cheyenne found him guilty on all counts. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison." Relief washed over Clara. Victor Harker's trial for the arson of her cabin had resulted in a conviction months ago, but the larger case against him for his crimes with Blackwell's gang had been ongoing. Now, finally, it was over. "So we're truly safe," she said, the last lingering fear she had carried finally dissolving. "We always were," Zach assured her. "But yes, Harker will never threaten anyone again." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the morning light spread across their land. After the confrontation at the cabin, things had moved swiftly. With compensation from Harker's seized assets, Clara had been able to sell her original homestead and purchase the valley property outright. She and Zach had spent the winter dividing their time between his ranch house and the cabin, slowly transforming the latter into a proper home. To Clara's surprise, Zach had suggested they make the cabin their primary residence once it was completed. "The ranch will always be there," he had explained. "But this is something we're building together, from the ashes of what was lost," and so they had. The one-room cabin had been expanded to include a proper bedroom and nursery. The stone fireplace had been carefully restored, and above it hung a framed photograph of Clara's parents alongside a picture from Zach and Clara's wedding day. On the mantel sat Clara's mother's silver locket, the one thing salvaged from the fire that had nearly claimed her life. "What are you thinking about?" Zach asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "How strange life is," Clara replied, looking up at the man who had broken down her door and saved her from the flames. "How the worst day of my life led me to the best ones." Zach's smile was tender as he placed a hand on her growing belly. "From destruction to creation." "It's the way of things, I suppose." "It is," Clara agreed, covering his hand with hers. "And I wouldn't change a moment of it." As they stood together in the morning light, the future stretching before them full of promise, Clara thought of the fire that had nearly ended her life. It had taken everything she owned, but in return, it had given her something far more precious, a love that had been forged in flames and would endure for a lifetime. Her cabin door wouldn't open from the fire, but the cowboy who had rammed it down saying, "You're coming out," had opened a door to a life more beautiful than she could have imagined. And for that, Clara Nash would be forever grateful.